As I've already warned you in an email, be prepared for biblical scenes on an epic scale with all their attendant devotion, cruelty, and passion, but also paintings of beautiful young men and boys, some nude, and no female nudes anywhere to be seen, which you may consider to be strong circumstantial evidence that Caravaggio was gay. He certainly never married and had no children that we know of. However, references to female lovers, and in some cases prostitutes, in contemporary letters and biographies suggest it's more likely he was bisexual. What's certain, according to his biographers, is that throughout his life he was reckless, quick-tempered, and promiscuous, often on the run from the law. Also be prepared to squint into the darkening shadows in search of subjects high-lit in bright shafts of light. For Caravaggio made the technique of chiaroscuro his very own trademark style. You think of chiaroscuro, dark backgrounds and brightly lit subjects, and you think of Caravaggio. We're told he worked at great speed using live models and scoring outlines on his canvases with the end of a brush, obviously not the end that he painted with. Indeed, very few preparatory sketches actually survive. So Caravaggio, born in 1571 and christened as Michelangelo Merisi, the first of 4 children, later took the name of Caravaggio, his hometown in Lombardy. So he was known eventually as Michelangelo di Caravaggio, a bit of a mouthful, that. By the age of 13, he was apprenticed to a Milanese painter and had lost every male in his family to the plague. Fortunately, his father had been well connected and had left property in and around the town. Caravaggio completed his artistic training at the age of 17. His mother died in 1590, and it was not until he was 21 that he left for Rome after the first of many brushes with the law. He first painted in the studio of the brothers d'Arpino and produced this work, Boy with a Basket of Fruit. It's quite a small canvas by Caravaggio's standards in the Bacchus gallery, a sensual portrait and almost tactile still life, fruit being a classical symbol of fertility and innocence. The light source is from the left, as was often the case in Caravaggio's paintings. According to a biography written by his contemporary and fellow painter Giovanni Baglioni, once in Rome, Caravaggio carried on pretty much from where he left off in Milan and quickly fell into a life of crime and debauchery, mixing with prostitutes, beggars, and the criminal lowlife, among whom he found Mario Militi, the effeminate youth who modelled for this painting, and others, as we shall see. They became friends for life, perhaps more than friends. The pose is both seductive and corruptive, and we have to ask, are we invited to partake of this basket of overripe fruit at a euphemistic level? So Caravaggio only ever produced one actual still life, which we'll see later in the talk, but that basket of fruit certainly counts as still life, I would have thought, and it's sumptuously painted. And you can see the musculature in the neck of the model is somewhat exaggerated, but because this is a very early painting. In the same gallery can be seen the little Bacchus, also painted sensually and thought to be a self-portrait. Cardinal Borghese bought both paintings, giving him the seal of approval, if raising eyebrows. At the time, Caravaggio's patronage came from religious institutions and rich individuals, such as the high-ranking Vatican official, Fantino Petriano, for whom he painted The Fortune Teller, which is in the Louvre. A gypsy girl is telling the fortune of a youth while subtly removing a ring from his finger. Now, if you can't see her subtly removing that ring from the finger, neither can I. But I dare say if we stood in front of the canvas, we would be able to discern it. But we're told that's what she's doing anyway. The gypsy is cast in shadow while the boy's face is highlit, suggesting his innocence and naivete. So that's a charming double portrait, I think. In that year, he also painted The Card Sharps. This is one of the rare Caravaggios to find its way into America. There aren't too many there. Painted against a flat background, the three-dimensional figures stand out. It's a playful picture, and despite its subject matter, is in no way sordid. And you can see from that we've got the gentleman in the middle is either whispering into the player on the left ear, telling him something about the cards of the player on the right, maybe, or distracting him. But what we can see very clearly is that on the right, the player is removing a card, and it's a club card, I can see, from the back of his tunic there, or he could be putting it back there, but I suspect he's actually removing it, and he's going to use it to win the game. It was the card sharps which caught the eye of Cardinal Del Monte, who immediately took Caravaggio into his service. In fact, Caravaggio moved into the Cardinal's home, Palazzo Madama, and never looked back, as they say. The year was 1595, and Caravaggio was 24. The Cardinal commissioned him to paint the musicians. The models are almost certainly friends from the street. Mario Minetti is again there playing the lute in the middle. The boy with the basket of fruit in the first painting. And it's generally believed that the figure to his right is an idealized self-portrait again. I'm not too convinced of that myself, but that is the art world's general opinion. Note the wings and quiver given to the boy on the left. You've got to look hard for them, but they are there. So this boy is turned into a Cupid figure for whatever reason. So it's a nicely composed painting. The four figures there are caught in various attitudes of, in whatever they're doing. They're making music, of course. The only one that's actually playing the instrument is this person here, this one here. And then the one on the extreme right, presumably is reading music. And that we got to assume is that violin there, or violin, whatever constitutes a violin in late 16th century paintings, is this person's. So notice his flesh tones, lovely flesh tones there, very delicately painted. And Caravaggio already showing great skill. We see Minetti, his friend, again in the lute player. This one's found itself to the Hermitage in Russia. The music is readily identifiable, we're told, as a 6th century madrigal. The first line of which is, "You know that I love you and adore you." Caravaggio later considered this the most beautiful painting he had ever painted, and there are actually 3 known versions of it. Again, we've got the Mario Minetti with the bouffon hairstyle there, and so something like a scarf. It can't be a scarf, but anyway, a tasseled effect coming from his hair. He's playing the lute, and the violin again makes an appearance there. And we've got this lovely still life, the fruit on the table, and then the flowers there on the extreme left, which balances the painting. Of course, the background is a dark, very dark umbers and ochres, and the light source coming from the left, making the figure of the lute player outstanding, literally outstanding. Another painting commissioned by Del Monte is the Ecstasy of St. Francis, painted in 1596. It shows St. Francis of Assisi at the moment of receiving the signs of the stigmata. It was widely believed that in 1224, the saint retired to the wilderness to contemplate God, and an angel came down to him in answer to a prayer that he should experience Christ's suffering. The eyes are painted almost closed. You have to look very hard at them, but you can see that they are slightly open. The light source on this occasion is unclear. It could be from above, maybe. And there are shepherds on the extreme left. Now, don't worry if you can't see them, but they are there. And again, it's a question of, if we were standing in front of the canvas, we probably would be able to pick them out. But there are shepherds there. Take my word for it, as I've had to take the word of others. St. Catherine of Alexandria, this painting is in Madrid, Prado, I believe, also belongs to the Del Monte paintings. The model is Fillide Melandroni, aka Phyllis. So we'll call her Phyllis from now on, I think. Ironically, a well-known prostitute Caravaggio was in love with at the time, and who, according to one biographer, caused him a lot of problems, though it's not specified what the problems are. It's a fine painting, as you can see. It's quite a large canvas, 68 by 52 wide. And of course, St. Catherine is posed by the broken wheel there. As you will remember, she was martyred by being broken on a wheel. And some beautiful painting of her dress. In fact, the dress occupies almost half the painting, really. We see Phyllis again. It seems strange to call her Phyllis, but it's such a modern name in many ways. But anyway, that's how she was known to Caravaggio, apparently. We see her again in this painting, the penitent Mary Magdalene, where it's perhaps more fitting that he chose a courtesan as his model. She's richly dressed and has discarded her jewels in shame on the floor at the bottom there. She's painted in a soft light, perhaps to emphasize forgiveness. And notice her ear is pierced. And Caravaggio has obviously quite intently kept that pierced earlobe in the painting for whatever reason. Unlike the standard paintings of Mary Magdalene, Caravaggio portrays her in contemporary dress with little hint of pathos. Possibly the pierced ear suggests an attempt at authenticity. Another painting from these Del Monte paintings, painted in the Palazzo Madama, is Rest on the Flight to Egypt. This painting is in Rome. Again, quite a large painting, 51 by 73, a very colourful composition, as you can see. Not much evidence of chiaroscuro there. Now, according to the legend, Joseph and Mary, fleeing from Herod, paused in a grove of trees where an angel commanded the trees to bend so that Joseph could pick their fruit, and a spring of water to appear to slake their food. It's a rather nice portrait of Mary and child there huddled around each other. And I love the blues of the angel's wings, which are traditionally white, as you know, but on this occasion, Caravaggio has contrasted the wings with the white of the angel's clothing. I really like those blues. Also painted at the Palazzo is Boy Bitten by a Lizard. Now this portrait is in the National Gallery, so many of you may have seen it in the flesh, as it were. And here again we find Caravaggio's friend or lover, Mario Minetti, posing as the boy. The reflection in the carafe reveals the studio window, and the cherries are almost certainly symbols of love. Notice again the bouffant hair and the androgynous features of the boy. Also the ambiguous flower in his hair, which relates to the flower in the carafe, making a nice little line of access for the painting. We see Minetti's bouffant hair again in the last of the Del Monte paintings, Bacchus. This is in the Uffizi gallery. It's quite a small painting. Dressed as the god of wine and good times. One of the more obviously homoerotic of his works, the god's sly, dreamy eyes seem to be offering himself to the viewer as he fingers the cord of his loosely draped robe. But notice the fruit is either going bad or appears overripe, as in the bursting pomegranate there, and there are the bad apples or peaches, not quite sure what they are. Clearly both intentionally symbolic. Disguised behind the veil of a mythological scene, the painting perhaps warns us of the rotting consequences of overindulgence. The moralizing allowed the Bacchus to pass under the nose of papal Rome, because you might be wondering how Caravaggio is getting away with these overtly homoerotic paintings. And we must ask, are these Del Monte paintings a veiled attempt to slake the cardinal's predilections, or are we being a little too cynical? I'll leave you to decide about that. Caravaggio did not leave Del Monte's protection until 1600, but from 1598, his paintings were being commissioned by other patrons too. In that year, he produced Judith beheading Holofernes, and he was commissioned to paint this by Ottavio Costa. Don't know much about Ottavio Costa, but he probably was a rich merchant. Many painters suggest this episode of the Old Testament. Many painters painted this episode of the Old Testament, I should say, including Artemisia Gentileschi, as discussed in an earlier talk. It's a ghastly image, focused as it is on the protagonist's state of mind, the old servant's grim appreciation of what Judith is doing, the victim's shock, of course, and Judith's steely determination. Now this, you're probably all aware of the story, the biblical story, that this general is an Assyrian general, was about to attack the Hebrews. I can't recall the name of the actual town, but except it began with B. And Judith, a widow, a Hebrew widow, took it upon herself to get him drunk one night and then to murder him and kill him, and thereby save the Hebrew village. As usually, the light comes from the left, and Caravaggio uses chiaroscuro to highlight the action, which never seems to shrug off the appearance of a waxworks tableau. I think that's a fair comment, but I love this beautiful drapery at the top of the painting, these this dark Venetian red there. But I think you'll agree the blood coming from the wound is completely unconvincing. And Judith's face, her expression is quite enigmatic, I think, but there's nothing enigmatic about the old crone's face there. Painters, as I said, were very keen on painting the beheading of Holofernes for whatever reason. I think there are maybe 20 to 30 versions of it. You could Google it and find out for yourself. And this, I should hasten to add, before we move on, hasten to add, this is another portrait, of course, of Phyllis. Phyllis has posed for Judith. In the next painting, we meet her again. And she's this portrait seems to be fairly straightforward, but I would ask you to look at her eyes. Maybe in actual fact the general expression on her face, because something is going on in her mind. She's a bit suspicious of the painter, the artist, I would suggest. For whatever reason, there's history there, isn't there? I think it's quite a small painting, only 26 by 21, and it's found its way to Berlin. However, from this time onward, Caravaggio seems to have turned his attention to more somber religious painting, and it was his first public commissions for altarpieces at the Cotrelli Chapel in Rome which made him famous. In the first, the calling of St. Matthew, Jesus is seen on the right with St. Peter. So there's Jesus with his arm outstretched, pointing straight at St. Matthew there, who's the tax collector, and he's counting with his retinue there. He's counting the villages or the towns' taxes. And this, we are told, is St. Peter. The light source on this occasion streams from the right for a change. And in contrast to the peasant garb of the two holy figures on the right, those around the table are clearly dressed in 17th century, early 17th century clothes. And it's very dark. It's a dark and light painting. It's typical chiaroscuro, and it looks to me as though on a flippant note, the windows could do with a good cleaning. The calling. Oh yes, right. Then at the same time, he painted the Martyrdom. This is again, is a large painting because it's an altarpiece, so it's 10.5 foot by 11 foot. St. Matthew was killed on the orders of the king of Ethiopia, whom he held to account for lusting after his own niece. That's the king's niece, of course. The figures scatter in all directions while an angel reaches down to the saint. There's the angel at the top there reaching down to the saint. And this is the assassin, of course. And there are the figures all running away as fast as they can. Rather ham pose there of this child, I think. Caravaggio's actually painted himself into this painting, and there he is, right in the background. That is a self-portrait of Caravaggio. Why he decided to include himself, we don't know. The chiaroscuro serves to pick out the most salient aspects of the scene. And remember, this is an altarpiece, so it's huge. The center altarpiece, which he painted last, and all three obviously are to do with St. Matthew, is the Inspiration of St. Matthew. Again, 9'8" by 6 foot, painted in 1602. The angel curiously seems to be ticking off bullet points on his or her celestial fingers on his left hand there, which the saint is perhaps writing down. So quite what's going on, we're not sure. Notice too how precariously balanced St. Matthew is on this. He's kneeling on a small bench or seat, and that is precariously rocking on the end of this whatever this is at the bottom. We don't know what it is, but it could be a beam or something like that. The whole thing looks as though he's about to topple over at any moment. It's not clear why he's painted him in that position. The positioning of these paintings in the chapel dictates, of course, how they are painted with regards to the lack of natural life in these areas. The figures, especially in the Martyrdom, loom out of the darkness. Now, there are the three paintings in situ. So there we've got the calling of St. Matthew, and then on the extreme right, we've got the assassination of St. Matthew, and then in the middle, we've got this angel dictating to St. Matthew, balanced precariously on this bench. It gives you an indication of how they actually looked, and of course how they look today. On the back of the immense prestige this commission brought him, Caravaggio immediately signed up to paint two more smaller New Testament scenes from the Cerasi chapel in Rome. Cerasi was the Vatican treasurer, and it was he who commissioned the paintings. The first we look at is the crucifixion of St. Peter. St. Peter asked to be crucified upside down so as not to rival Jesus. The position of this painting in the chapel is critical, since St. Peter is painted deliberately with his head turned towards the crucifix on the high altar. Now, you've got to assume the high altar is here, so St. Peter would be looking straight at it. The perfunctory efforts of the three executioners, however, detract the eye from the head of St. Peter, I think. This character at the bottom there is taking the weight of the cross. I think they've already driven the nails into St. Peter's hand there, and then these two characters are in the throes of actually erecting it upside down. So there's a lot going on in this painting. And again, we've got the dark and the light, so highlighting the figures very strongly. The red of this well, I mean, one assumes that these are executioners. They're not soldiers, as in Jesus's case, but they're executioners. So we got the lovely red there on the right, at extreme left, and then we got this dark sage green, and then the rest of including the skin, the rest of the figures are painted basically in yellow ochres of various values, tonal values. The companion work, situated on the other side of the altar, depicts the conversion of St. Paul on the road to Damascus. The use of chiaroscuro, or tenebrism, as it's also called. There is a subtle difference between chiaroscuro and tenebrism, but I won't go into that now. The use of chiaroscuro ignores Paul's account that the conversion occurred at high noon, but it does emphasize the visitation by contrasting the light against the dark colors. So in the Bible, in the New Testament, we're told it happened at high noon, and that looks like a nighttime scene, does it not? Although it could represent some sort of an eclipse event, possibly. And here are the two portraits in situ, again, give you an idea of them. They're much smaller, of course, than the altarpieces. As I've said, 90 by 70, both of them exactly 90 inches by 70 inches. So they're still large, on the large side. This painting is done by another Italian painter whose name escapes me, and probably wouldn't mean a lot to you anyway. It certainly didn't mean a lot to me. So there we are. There's the two paintings in situ in the chapel, in the altar. In 1601, he painted the only still life which survives. So he may have painted others, but this is the only one we know of, Basket of Fruit. It's thought to be 1601, but some scholars think it might have been earlier. I'll just let you, I haven't got anything much to say about that, so I'll just let you look at it for a moment. Enjoy the colours. It's quite a subdued painting, really. And one wonders, very rarely, of course, the background is very light, as you can see, very, very pale, thinly painted yellow ochres again, and lemon yellows possibly. If that had been burnt sienna or very dark umber, that would have stood out even more. But so probably that would have been too much then. I think it works okay as it is. In the same year, he also painted Supper at Emmaus. Now, this is a painting a lot of you will have seen in the National Gallery. It's one of the few Caravaggios in the National Gallery. St. Peter is on the left. This is St. Peter with his elbows. Looks to be, whether he's got patches there or not, I don't know, but they look as though they're coming apart at the seams to me. And this character with his hands out in the shape of a cross is Cleophas. Actually, I don't think, if you look carefully at that hand, that Cleophas's right hand, it doesn't seem to work very well. It looks to be over large to me, much larger than this hand, which should be the larger of the two. But there we are. What else we got? So Caravaggio attempts to capture the sudden moment of recognition, and possibly following St. Mark's comment that Jesus appeared in another likeness, he painted him without a beard, which is obviously is quite a surprise to us, isn't it? We're so used to seeing Jesus painted with a beard, but this is Jesus not only without a beard, but he's got rather chubby cheeks there, and that's reflected in this rather sumptuous meal on the table. And remember, this is a meal for pilgrims, so one wouldn't have expected them to be eating so well. It's a very famous painting. I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, are very familiar with it. What you may not be familiar with is another version that he did, which is in Milan, and this is the other version of the Supper. And now he's reverted to the chiaroscuro technique par excellence. I think you'll agree. Everybody is barely visible in the darkness of this painting, and certainly the fare on the table, the food on the table, is far more meager and more in keeping with two pilgrims walking on the road. And then we've also got the addition of this hag-like figure in the top right-hand corner, and the landlord, who's looking on in a rather bemused fashion, has been altered quite considerably. There's a landlord there, more of a joyful character, I think. In fact, this painting is a more joyful painting altogether than the painting he did later and now hangs in Milan. At about this time, Caravaggio came under the patronage of Marchese Giustiniani, a rich merchant who acquired over 15 of Caravaggio's paintings over his lifetime. The earliest he's known to have owned is this one, The Incredulity of St. Thomas, Doubting Thomas. It was a picture much copied even while Caravaggio was alive. Notice there's no halo over Jesus, possibly to emphasize his appearance in human form. So there we've got the four characters nicely composed in an arc, really, looking around the wound, and no subtlety about the question of Jesus's wound made by the spear when he was on the cross, of course, because Thomas is Jesus. This is Jesus's hand. I take it to be Jesus's hand, and he's got hold of Thomas's hand, and he's thrust the finger right inside the wound. So there is no ambiguity there whatsoever. This picture heralded a burst of activity from 1600 to 1606, some of which were religious paintings, and controversially some risque canvases, echoing earlier work and Caravaggio's interest in the homoerotic. In roughly the same period, Caravaggio was busy on another front. He is cited in police records 14 times and jailed 7 times during this 6-year period. Some offences, in fact, involved serious bodily harm, and his patrons continually bailed him out so that he could paint. So it's just as well he could paint. At no time did he venture into the streets, we're told, without a sword in his belt. Caravaggio was a troublemaker, there's no doubt about that. The painting Victorious Amor, which is in Berlin, commissioned by the Marchesa, was so admired that it secured his release from jail on at least one occasion. Cupid is painted with a roguish smile and tousled hair rising from a bed and trampling on the life of the senses, represented by sheet music and various instruments, a T-square and a compass, items associated with astronomy as well as armor. We can see all that is all hugger-mugger down the bottom of the painting there. Thus, the moralizing message of the painting cloaks the homoeroticism of the boy's stark nudity. And you notice there is no question of a fig leaf for this boy. Caravaggio is surely pushing the boundaries of what was acceptable to depict, as long as the painting wasn't heretical. And it's worth noting that sodomy was a capital offense at this time in Rome. So sailing close to the wind is a phrase that comes to mind. The same model is surely used in the Youth with a Ram, 52 by 38, which hangs in Rome at the moment. At the time, this was considered to be a painting of John the Baptist, believe it or not. You may well raise your eyebrows. The androgynous youth with the ram leering at him close up is simply not acceptable as a Christian figure. Most modern opinion sees him more as, and I quote from one critic, a little pagan tease uncontaminated by Christian sentiment. Again, Caravaggio, no longer under the Cardinal Del Monte's influence, has become audacious enough to abandon discretion. If we compare this painting with one he produced 3 years later, specifically of John the Baptist, then the treatment is in sharp relief, and we can happily discount the youth of the earlier painting as John the Baptist. The deeply set eyes of this figure in shadow and the somber expression suggest an individual deep in thought. The emphasis is clearly intended to be on the inner life of the spirit. Though John is painted as a very young man indeed, is not the usual picture painting of John the Baptist that we're used to. He's extremely young there. I would say he's still in his late teens, possibly. And again, we've got this lovely Venetian red, although it's pale this time, but there's lovely drapes here I mean, Caravaggio was a master painter. There's no two ways about that. This man could really paint. He might have been a rogue, but he could really paint. And of course, the fact that he was such a brilliant painter got him out of trouble so many times. Back to the Old Testament iconography. In 1603, he painted the Sacrifice of Isaac. This painting hangs in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. This is the third time we see the model of the androgynous youth of the previous two paintings. I'll leave you to speculate why Isaac is presented bent over in that fashion. And I'll pass quickly on to the Entombment. This was completed in 1604 as an altarpiece for the Church of Santa Maria in Vallicella, though it's since found its way to the Vatican, where it resides today. There are at least 44 copies of this painting in existence, either drawn, painted, or engraved. It's thought Caravaggio may have had in mind Michelangelo's Pieta, which is in St. Peter's Basilica, when he painted this. The fan-shaped composition, you can see the fan shape there, of the group suggesting a sculpture. The turn of Nicodemus's head, and this character is Nicodemus. Incidentally, this is thought to be a portrait of Michelangelo. And if you see other portraits on self-portraits of Michelangelo, then that's quite convincing as a portrait of the great painter. And because he's looking directly out of the painting, he's inviting the viewer or worshipper into the scene. Untraditionally, Caravaggio paints the Virgin as an older woman. There's the Virgin, and she is quite a lot older, although it's perhaps not too clear in this painting. But if you a close-up of it would show you the lines in her brow, which is quite untypical. It's thought the courtesan Phyllis modelled for all three women. Well, yeah, we can see the likeness there of Phyllis if you can cast your mind back to earlier paintings, but apparently they're all three various versions of the model Phyllis. It's hard to imagine how Caravaggio was producing religious works while living the outrageous life he was, in and out of bordellos and jail. Another such painting is Ecce Homo, painted in competition with two other artists, we're told. He didn't win the competition, though he had a 3-in-1 chance of winning it. I'd be interested to see the winner, but I don't think it survived. He didn't win and fled to Genoa for a short time after assaulting a lawyer in an argument over a well-known courtesan named Lena, known to be one of Caravaggio's models. Now, what I find interesting about this painting is the figure of Pontius Pilate there, and his very expressive face. I'll let you look at him for a moment. He's presenting Christ, of course, to the public, and they've got to make a choice between Christ and Barabbas as to who's going to be pardoned on that day. This servant in the background, holding this drape over Jesus's body there, is quite delicately painted, and I think is quite a charming addition to the painting. There's a gentleness about the attitude, the way he's painted, I think. But I really love this. This isn't a typical what we're used to as imagining Pontius Pilate, and he's certainly not dressed as a Roman general or administrator. He's dressed in contemporary clothes, easily attested by the hat there. In September 1605, Caravaggio was described as being of no fixed abode, but wearing rich clothing worn to tatters. It was a year in which he began an altarpiece for a Vatican lawyer in the Carmelite church of Santa Maria della Scala, the death of the Virgin. So this being an altarpiece, of course, is huge again, 12 foot by 8 foot. The figures are almost life-size, in fact. The New Testament makes no mention of the Virgin's death, and it was not until 1997 that Pope John Paul II affirmed that Mary did indeed experience natural death prior to her assumption into heaven. So it might be said that this painting is well ahead of its time. I mean, we usually see the Virgin on clouds descending into heaven, surrounded by putti and cherubim and seraphim. But here, this is a more natural death. The Virgin there laid out on her bed, and everybody, all the mourners, the apostles, of course, are somewhat older now. We've got at least 1, 2, 3 balding pates there. And again, this beautiful red drapery, which Caravaggio is so fond of, at the top of the painting, and that is reflected in the lighter red, sort of cadmium red, I would say, of the Virgin's clothes. The Virgin not in blue, for a change. So this ticks many boxes as regards iconoclastism, if there's such a word. Caravaggio is clearly aiming for realism in this painting. However, it was rejected by the clergy. They refused to pay for it, and it was finally sold to the Duke of Mantua on the advice of Rubens, who, among others, admired it greatly. And it's eventually arrived nearly 200 years later in the Louvre, as you can see from the caption at the top. In the following year, 1606, on May the 29th, an argument broke out at a tennis match with Ranuzio Tomassoni, possibly over a woman, but though it's not clear what they were arguing about. At first, they fought with their rackets, but a challenge was issued, and that evening, where they agreed to meet to settle the dispute, Caravaggio killed him with a sword. Though he himself was wounded, he fled to the hills outside Rome, where he was beyond the jurisdiction of the Pope. By October, he'd escaped to Naples, which belonged to Spain at that time, and could give him protection against the Italian authorities who were in hot pursuit. His presence there was quickly noted, and his reputation as an artist having preceded him, his skills were immediately in demand. He painted the altarpiece, The Seven Acts of Mercy, in 1606, again a huge canvas, for the Church of Misericordia in Naples, where it is now is. Now, of the 7 acts, I'm not going to go through all 7 of them, but one is Bury the Dead, and we get that illustrated by these 2 undertakers, for want of a better word, and the corpse's feet are just visible there. They're just carrying him out. Then another one is Visit to the Imprisoned and Feeding the Hungry, and that's exemplified by this woman here offering her breast to a prisoner so that he can drink her milk. And then a third one is Shelter for the Homeless, and a pilgrim, third from the left, as identified by a shell in his hat. You'll have to take my word for it. That it's there, but you can't see it on this scale. Asks an innkeeper on the far. There's the innkeeper on the far left for shelter, and then a fourth one is Clothe the Naked, and St. Martin. This is St. Martin, and he's ripping his cloak up so that to give it to this homeless character, this naked beggar on the floor there. As I said, I'm not going to go through all the 7 acts of mercy. And then he was particularly commissioned to include the Madonna and Child and angels right at the top of the painting. So most of the action is in the lower half of the painting, as you can see, but then we've got this celestial vignette at the top there, and nicely done, I think, with the wings there forming a sort of oval shape, and then the one angel reaching down and making the connection with the 7 acts of mercy. Quickly upon his arrival in Naples, he also painted the Flagellation. This is 9 foot by 6 foot, another altarpiece. Caravaggio has painted movement into this painting. Notice Christ's feet there under the scourge of the lash, moving, to try and avoid it in a pathetic way. The chiaroscuro technique suits the dingy dungeon, of course. Notice this executioner here, or torturer, whatever you like to call him. He's sort of holding Jesus upright, I think. I'm not quite sure what this one on the right is doing, but this one at the bottom there seems to be making another lash or scourge. And then we've got this light, this suggestion of light, the light source coming from above this time. But I want you to notice this character in particular, because he's going to be, we're going to see him again in the next painting, Salome. And there he is on the right, definitely the same model, probably a local. And this too, this painting too, is in the National Gallery. Caravaggio turns the well-known narrative into a psychological study of the protagonist's personalities. He's done this before, none of whom seem to convey the magnitude of what they have done. Salome's expression, and this won't be Phyllis. It looks a bit like Phyllis, but we've got to assume that Phyllis is left back in Rome, but she may have traveled with him, maybe, we don't know. Anyway, her expression is particularly baffling, whereas the executioner, the headsman, the axeman, it seems to be saying, oh, it's all in a day's work. He is not fazed by it in the slightest. And then we've got another example of Caravaggio's penchant for old faces, the maidservant looking on there enigmatically. We're not told who the face of John the Baptist is modelled on there. In the same year, 1607, Caravaggio moved on to Malta, where he straightaway painted Adolphe de Vignacourt, the Grand Master of the Knights of Malta. This is a large painting, 77 by 53, found its way into the Louvre. And he painted it probably to curry favour for his protection, it's suggested. As a reward, he was made a knight, which it's been suggested may have been the reason for him actually going to Malta in the first place. While briefly there, he also painted the Decapitation of St. John the Baptist, again, 12 foot by 17 foot. This is 17 foot. This is huge. And it's still in the cathedral in Malta today. It's a huge painting, more than life-size. And actually, uniquely, the only one he ever signed. And he signed his name, typical of Caravaggio, because we're all getting a good sense of Caravaggio by now. He signed his name in the blood at the bottom there, coming from the wound. You can't possibly see it at this distance, but take my word for it, it's there. The room itself can still be visited today. It is used to display armor. It was commissioned by the Knights of Malta and still hangs in St. John's Cathedral, Valletta, as I say, from where it was commissioned, and where Caravaggio himself was raised to the order of the Knights of Malta. His service as a knight was, however, brief. You won't be surprised to hear, about 3 months, following his imprisonment for some unrecorded crime. He escaped, but was kicked out of the order anyway, not unsurprisingly, and I quote, for being a foul and rotten member. From Malta, he fled to Syracuse in Sicily. Here he met up with his old friend Mario Minetti. You'll remember him from the androgynous portraits in this early androgynous portraits in the early paintings. Now Mario, now himself a painter, who arranged for him to paint an altarpiece for the church of Santa Lucia. This is called the Burial of Saint Lucy. And being an altarpiece, again, it's a huge painting. When seen from the distance of the nave, the contrasting scale between the giant gravediggers, as you can see, and they are huge, and the mourners in the background there, disappears. And there it is in situ. It doesn't really illustrate that point very clearly, but it's nice to see it in situ anyway, I think. But I mean, they are definitely very, very large, these gravediggers, compared to the corpse. And they're not very far away from St. Lucia herself. So they definitely appear to us at this distance to be rather too large, too largely painted, I think. There's a whiff of a suspicion that Caravaggio, constantly on the run, was being pursued by the Knights of Malta, which may explain why he quickly moved north to Messina, arriving there in 1609. He set up a studio in the hospital and soon after his arrival was commissioned to paint the altarpiece, The Resurrection of Lazarus. Notice the outstretched arms suggesting of Lazarus, the body suggesting a cross, the palm, the right hand palm there just catching the light from the left, whereas the left hand appears to be earthing the body. According to his biographer Francesco Susino, he destroyed the first version of this painting with a razor in a fit of rage because somebody had made some minor criticism of it. And you notice again, this is yet another painting where everything's happening in the bottom half, and in the top half, we've just simply got the brown, the dark brown plains, almost like a mist there. And I think he painted Lazarus very well. We get a sense of the putrefaction of this body in contrast to the figure of Christ, which it looks very authoritarian and is commanding the body back to life. And Mary and Martha are there on the extreme right, of course. The Messinese Senate then commissioned him to paint the Adoration of the Shepherds, another altarpiece for the Capuchin Church of Santa Maria. A simple, calm scene without the usual Christian paraphernalia of angels and putti and cherubs, etc. The halos being just a wisp of light. You can hardly see the halo, but it is just there, and just there again on Joseph. There's nothing metaphysical about this image, as Caravaggio again aims for authenticity and realism. Humility is expressed by seating the young mother on the ground and by the peasant clothes of the man arrayed in the classical triangle formation. So this is very typical Caravaggio, the dark background, undetailed, and the light streaming in from the left to illuminate the clothes and the drapery and the folds in the clothes and the skin of the shepherds. On returning to Naples later that year, after yet another dispute, this time with a schoolmaster in Messina over his over-keen attention to some of the male students, he was reported wounded in a tavern brawl. His temper hadn't improved with age. His patrons in Rome rescued him yet again. And in 1610, Cardinal Gonzaga arranged a pardon for his original killing of Tomasoni, though Caravaggio never actually went back to Rome, perhaps distrusting the pardon. Instead, he made for Tuscany, where he was mistaken for another fugitive upon landing and thrown into prison. When released after 2 days, all his possessions had disappeared, and he set off down the beach to Porto Ecole, where he eventually arrived sick and raving with fever. He died alone 2 days later at the age of 38. However, we have one more painting to look at, which may have been his last painting, although the date is disputed, but there's some evidence that it was his final work. And that is this painting, David with the Head of Goliath, not a particularly large painting, 49 by 39, and this too is in the Bacchus gallery in Rome. Now, it's been suggested that this painting was a gift to the cardinal in exchange for his pardon. It's certain that he painted the giant's head with his own features, and some have speculated that David too is also modelled on his younger self, his memory of his younger self. And I think if we look back to the earlier paintings, there is some justification in that consideration. Now, if that is the case, when we're looking at this portrait, we are looking at two self-portraits and perhaps a fitting conclusion to his life's work. So the beginning of his life and the end of his life. But he certainly spared himself not a jot in this figure of Goliath's head, where he painted himself almost as a damned soul. Now, I'll finish the talk here, leaving you with one last arresting image, though it's not of a painting. At about the time Richard III's bones were being discovered in a Leicester car park, you'll remember, in 2010, Italian researchers found bones in a Porto Ecole crypt of a man aged between 37 and 45, who died around 1610, according to carbon dating. The bones contained high levels of lead and other metals consistent with those of a painter. And the Italians are convinced that they are the remains of Michelangelo Merisi di Caravaggio. And those are the bones nicely laid out. Not the entire skeleton, but the bones that are claimed to be those of Caravaggio. And I'll leave the talk there with you looking at Caravaggio's bones.